If this had been an ordinary Tuesday, no one would have noticed the new maid at all. But Wren Calder had been at Alderley Hall 9 days when the laughter started in the drawing-room, and Lord Gabriel Ashworth, Marquess of Thorne, sat at the centre of it as still as a church effigy, while a viscount's idle son leaned close enough to be cruel and called him a dumb brute to his face. Certain the words would land on nothing at all. She did not know yet that answering would cost her the only position that stood between her family and the workhouse. She would have answered anyway. The room smelled of lily pollen and spilled ratafia, and the guest, a florid young man named Mr. Reginald Pike, was enjoying himself the way men enjoy themselves when they have found an audience that cannot report them, and the audience, 3 young ladies, a dowager with an ear-trumpet, and Mr. Simon Vane standing sentinel by the mantel, laughed on cue, because that was what one did in this house when the Marquess sat silent, and someone made a joke of his silence. Gabriel did not laugh. His hands lay flat on his knees, and there was a stillness to them that a lesser observer would have called deference. But Wren had spent a childhood watching a pair of hands hold themselves in exactly that way, deliberately, at cost, and she knew stillness for what it truly was, the look of a man taking a blow without letting his face report it. She had come in only to return a dropped fan. She stayed in the doorway 1 breath longer than her errand required, and in that breath Mr. Pike said, more loudly, enunciating each word as though speaking to a dull child or a deaf dog, that it was a mercy the Marquess could not hear how little use he was to anyone. Wren set the fan down on the side table. Her hands moved before her good sense caught up with them, 2 fingers touching her palm, then rising to her chin, then opening outward. "He does not mean nothing by it," she signed. "Watch his eyes. He means it entirely. And he is a coward for saying it where you thought no one could answer." Gabriel turned. It was not the slow, courteous turn of a man acknowledging a servant. It was the turn of a man who has heard, for the first time in longer than he could easily count, a voice that was not his own inside a silence he had thought belonged to him alone. The room did not understand what had happened. Gabriel did. His eyes went to her hands, then to her face, and something in his jaw loosened that had not been loose a moment before. Mr. Pike, oblivious, was still chuckling into his glass. It was Mr. Simon Vane who moved first, crossing the carpet with the unhurried grace of a man closing an account book. His cuffs immaculate, his smile immaculate, everything about him the practised immaculateness of a man who has learned that gentleness is the fastest way to end a conversation he does not wish continued. He is not accustomed to being addressed by the staff. "Mr." Vane said pleasantly, "to no one and everyone, and his lordship tires easily in company, and perhaps the girl might return to her duties." It was said kindly. It was said the way a hand closes over a candle flame, kindly, and the flame goes out all the same. Wren curtsied and left, and did not breathe evenly again until she reached the stone stairs down to the servants' hall, where Mrs. Pruitt, the housekeeper, took one look at her face and said only, "Well, and who did you insult?" Wren told her. Mrs. Pruitt did not scold. She set down her mending, which was itself remarkable, and said that in 11 years in this house she had never once seen anyone speak a plain word to that boy that wasn't first strained through Mr. Vane like tea through a cloth, and that the old Duke upstairs was dying by inches, and had set his mind on seeing his son settled by Michaelmas, married and managed and safe, before God or gout took him, whichever came first, and that Michaelmas was 10 weeks off and closing like a fist. Wren asked carefully what settled meant. Mrs. Pruitt's needle stopped. "It means a bride his cousin has already chosen for him," she said, "and papers already drawn, and if there is no bride and no wits proven fit to hold an estate, there is a trustee instead, and I will leave you to guess which cousin has offered himself for that particular sacrifice." Wren said nothing to that. She had learned, in a hard school, that a girl in her position kept her opinions where her hands could not betray them, and she went up that night to bank the fires in the east wing, with her face arranged into the careful blankness of 9 days' good behaviour. It was there, in the corridor outside the music room that no one used, that she found a folded paper pushed half beneath a door that was never opened, addressed to no one, in a hand so careful it might have been carved rather than written. It said only, "Thank you." She did not know who had left it until she turned and found Gabriel Ashworth standing at the far end of the corridor in his shirt-sleeves, watching her read it, his face doing the thing faces do when they have decided, against long practice, to hope for something. He sent for her the next afternoon, which was itself an event, because the Marquis of Thorn did not send for housemaids, and Mrs. Pruitt delivered the summons with her eyebrows already halfway to her cap. Wren found him in the estate office with the account books open before him, like a man fortifying a position. And he did not rise, and he did not smile, and he wrote on a fresh sheet of paper before she had fully closed the door, "Who taught you?" She answered with her hands rather than her voice, because it seemed suddenly the more honest instrument, and told him her father, and that her father had been deaf from a fall at 9 years old, and that she had grown up in a house where hands did the work mouths could not be trusted with. Gabriel watched her sign the way a starving man watches a table being laid. When she finished he wrote, "He taught you well." Then, after a pause in which his pen hovered, as if deciding whether a door should open further, he wrote, "Does everyone here think I am a fool?" Wren considered lying, the way a girl in her position was trained to consider lying, and found she could not make her hands do it. "Not everyone," she signed. "Some think you are furniture. Some think you are a burden. Mr. Vane thinks you are his to interpret as he pleases, and I think that is the more dangerous opinion of the two. Though I have known you one day, and you may tell me I am impertinent." He laughed. It was not a large laugh, only a short exhale through the nose, and a flash of something startled and pleased crossing his face like weather. But Wren filed it away the way her father had once filed away the first true tick of a repaired clock, as evidence that a broken thing could, under the right hands, be persuaded to run again. He wrote terms after that, because he was his father's son, and negotiation was in his blood whether or not sound reached his ears. She would come to him an hour each evening, ostensibly to see to the fires, in truth to teach him nothing he did not already know, and to give him, for 1 hour, a conversation that had not passed through anyone else's hands first. She was not to speak of it below stairs. She was not, he wrote, and underlined it twice, to imagine this was kindness owed to her, or affection, or anything beyond a starving man asking for bread. Wren signed back that she had not imagined anything of the kind, "Thank you," and that she would take the hour and leave her imagination at the door. It was, she thought afterward, the first wholly honest bargain anyone had offered her since her father died. She did not tell him that. She had learned early that some doors, once opened, could not be closed again, and she was not yet ready to test which kind of door this was. That evening, below stairs, Mrs. Pruitt asked no questions. which was its own kind of question, and only set an extra log by the hearth, and told Wren that her father, God rest him, would have been glad to know his teaching had found a use, and then told her, unprompted, the story of how the old Duke had once been a laughing man before the fever took the boy's hearing, and within the year, the Duchess's life along with it, nursing him past the point her own strength could bear. "It is why the old man wants him settled so badly, Mrs., Pruitt said, tucking a blanket round her own knees like armour. Guilt makes a man impatient. He thinks if the boy is married and safe he can finally put down what he's been carrying 11 years, and Mr. Vane has made very sure he believes there's only one road to safe, and that road runs directly through Mr. Vane's own hands." Simon Vane did not summon Wren to his study for another 8 days, and when he did it with the particular courtesy of a man closing a trap gently enough that the animal inside mistakes it for a door. He offered her tea she did not want, and asked, in the mildest voice in any room he had ever occupied, how she found the household, and whether she found her duties agreeable, and whether— here his eyes went, briefly, to the window and back, a man arranging a sentence the way he arranged his cuffs, whether she understood how delicate his lordship's situation truly was. "I am only a maid, sir," Wren said, which was a lie of omission rather than fact, and Simon Vane smiled as though she had confirmed something for him. "Of course," he said, "and a maid ought to remember that his lordship cannot always judge for himself who means him well and who does not, being cut off as he is, and that those of us who have loved him since he was a boy in a sick-bed have made it our life's work to stand between him and anyone who might mistake pity for opportunity." He said opportunity the way another man might say vermin. Wren understood, without a single word spent on the understanding, that she had just been warned, and that the warning had been dressed so carefully in love that a listener with less practice than her father had given her might have thanked him for it. She thanked him for the tea instead, and left with her hands folded and her pulse loud in her own ears. Below stairs the household had begun, in the way of households, to notice things it could not name. That his lordship rang for the new girl to bank his fire at an hour when the fire needed no banking. That he had been seen, twice, nearly smiling at nothing anyone else could see. That a footman named Davy had a standing wager with the second groom about whether Mr. Ganked. Vane's nose was going to be put out of joint before Michaelmas or after. Wren heard none of the wager directly, only its echo in Mrs. Pruitt's dry recitation of it, delivered with the flat satisfaction of a woman who had bet a shilling herself. It was in the small hours of a Thursday, carrying a tray no one had asked for past the estate office, that Wren first saw the transcript book lying open on Mr. Vane's own desk in the adjoining room, its door ajar, candlelight falling across a page she had no business reading, and read anyway, because she had spent that very afternoon standing 3 feet from Gabriel while he signed, with perfect and unhesitating clarity, that he had not yet decided whether he wished to receive Miss Cordelia Asher again, and would prefer time. The page before her, in Simon Vane's careful hand, recorded that his lordship had expressed himself eager for the match, and wished the settlement drawn forward with all convenient speed. She stood very still. She had grown up believing that ink did not lie, because paper could not feel shame, and here was proof that paper felt exactly as much shame as the hand that held the pen allowed it to feel, which was to say none at all. She did not touch the book. She did not need to. She carried the memory of that page back to her small room under the eaves, the way her father used to carry a cracked mainspring home in his coat pocket, turning it over and over. learning the exact shape of the break before deciding how it must be mended. The estate office became, over the following weeks, a place with its own weather, warm in a way the rest of Alderley Hall was not, and it was there, bent together over a correspondence Gabriel could not safely answer alone, that Wren told him about her father properly. The whole of it, not the polished version she gave to strangers. Josiah Calder had kept a clockmaker's shop in a market town 3 days' ride from here, deaf since a fall from a hayloft at 9, brilliant with his hands, trusted by half the parish until the other half decided a deaf man could not be trusted to set a fair price, and had spread that opinion the way damp spreads through a wall, quietly, until his custom dried up and his credit dried up after it, and he had died, in the end, of a fever that a stronger, less worn-down man might have shaken off, still owed money by people who had once called him neighbour. My mother sold the clocks to bury him. Wren signed. And I have been in service since I was 15, and I do not tell people this, because pity is a coin nobody spends generously, and I have learned to do without it. Gabriel's hands were still for a long moment after that, which she had learned by now was not absence but its opposite. And then he wrote, in the margin of a letter that was not his to deface, that he was sorry, and that he understood better than most men in this house what it cost a person to be thought less than they were, simply because the world had decided in advance how much listening they deserved. Then he asked, carefully, whether her father had ever laughed. Every day she signed. He laughed with his whole chest, the way men laugh who have decided grief will not have the last word in their house. Gabriel considered this a long while, and then, apropos of nothing, signed to her the driest possible observation about Mrs. Pruitt's habit of wiping her hands on her apron before touching anything at all, wet or dry, as though the world itself required constant polishing, and Wren laughed before she could arrange her face into anything more suitable to her station, and Gabriel laughed too. A real laugh this time, startled out of him and unguarded, his shoulders dropping 1/2 inch. His eyes bright with something that had clearly not had daylight in some years. She would remember that laugh longest, afterward, though she did not know that yet. What she knew, in the moment, was only that a milestone had been passed that neither of them had named aloud, and that the hour allotted to fires and correspondence had stretched, without either of them quite agreeing to it, into 2. Hands do not lie, her father used to say, only mouths, and Wren had spent her whole life believing it a comfort. Sitting across the desk from a man whose hands had just told her, without a single sign for the word, that he trusted her more than he had trusted anyone in 11 years, she understood for the first time that it could also be a danger, because a thing that cannot lie can also not protect itself from being read by someone who means it harm. The blow, when it came, arrived dressed as concern, which was the only costume Simon Vane ever wore to work. He requested an audience with the old Duke on a morning when Gabriel was riding the north boundary with the steward, and he brought with him the transcript book, and a folded note in Wren's own hand, a note she recognised instantly as the one she had written weeks before. At Gabriel's own asking, listing 3 plain English phrases he might practise mouthing for Miss Ashie's benefit at supper, an act of pure and foolish kindness, now lying on the Duke's writing table like evidence at an inquest. "Your Grace," Simon said, and his voice at last carried a tremor, whether genuine or manufactured Wren would spend a long time afterward trying to decide. "I would not trouble you with this if I did not fear for him. The new girl has taken it upon herself to instruct his lordship privately, at night, unchaperoned, in matters that are not hers to instruct, and I have reason to believe, He laid the note down as gently as a man laying down a winning hand. I have reason to believe she has been coaching him toward refusing the Ash settlement altogether, perhaps hoping to make herself indispensable to a man who cannot easily replace what little communication he is permitted. He did not say what he meant her to want. He did not have to. The old Duke, grey-faced and short of breath even sitting still, looked at the note a long time, and Wren, summoned an hour later to explain herself, found herself standing in the same room where she had once returned a dropped fan, being asked by a dying man to account for a kindness that had somehow, in the retelling, become a conspiracy. She told the truth. The truth, unfortunately, required explaining that his lordship's own cousin had misrecorded a private wish as an eager consent, and there is no way to say such a thing to a man who has trusted that cousin for 11 years without sounding, herself, like the one who cannot be trusted. The Duke did not dismiss her outright. He did something worse. In its quiet way, he thanked her for her honesty, said he was certain no harm was meant, and asked that she confine herself to her ordinary duties until the matter of the settlement was settled, for everyone's peace. What had been, a week before, the safest hour of her day had become, in the space of one interview, the very thing that might undo her. She did not see Gabriel alone again for 9 days, and the not seeing did its own quiet damage, because a man who has spent 11 years reading absence as rejection does not easily believe that silence might mean something other than abandonment. And Wren had no way to explain herself to him that did not pass first through the very channel that had betrayed them both. She caught him once in the long gallery, and signed quickly, before a passing footman's eyes could find them, that she had not chosen this, that Mr. Vane had turned her own kindness into a weapon, and Gabriel's face, for one terrible moment, gave her nothing back at all, the old stillness closing over it like water over a dropped stone. And he walked on. It was Simon Vane who found her that same evening in the linen room, and set upon the shelf beside her, without preamble, a small leather purse that clinked with more coin than she earned in half a year, along with a folded character reference already written out in a clerk's careful hand, needing only a signature. £20, he said, and a good word to any house in the county, and a coach to the posting in the morning, and no more said about any of it, ever, by anyone. He smiled the smile that had smoothed over 100 rooms before this one. It is not unkindness, Miss Calder, it is mercy. You are a bright girl, in a position that was never going to end well for you, and I am offering you an ending that does not end badly at all. Wren looked at the purse a long moment, long enough that he clearly believed the matter settled, and then she pushed it back across the shelf toward him with 2 fingers, as though it were something that might soil her hand by lingering. "I will keep my position, sir," she said, "until I am dismissed from it honestly, by someone with an honest reason." Her voice did not shake, though her hands, out of his sightline, were pressed flat against her apron to keep them from doing so. Simon Vane's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes recalculated, the way a man's face changes when a sum he expected to balance does not. "Then you will be dismissed," he said pleasantly, and left the purse exactly where it sat, which she understood, later, was not carelessness, but a promise. The theft was discovered 4 days after that, or rather was announced as discovered. A small enamelled locket belonging to the late Duchess reported missing from a drawer, to which, it emerged in the telling, only 2 people in the household had recent occasion to hold a key. One of them the housekeeper of 11 years' unimpeachable service, and the other a maid of not quite 8 weeks who had. everyone now recalled with the perfect clarity of hindsight, been seen loitering near the family apartments at odd hours. Wren was given 1 hour to gather her things. She did not weep, not where anyone could see it, and packed her small trunk with the particular efficiency of a girl who had done this kind of leaving before, and had learned that grief spent on packing was grief wasted, better saved for later, in private, where it could not be used against her. It was Mrs. Pruitt who came to her at the last, ostensibly to see the room left tidy, and pressed into her hand, without a word of explanation, a small brass key. The music-room, Mrs. Pruitt said, low and fast, her usual dryness entirely absent. Her Grace's writing desk. I have dusted that room 11 years, and never once opened the locked drawer. Because it was not mine to open, but I think, girl, that you had better open it before you go. Because I do not believe in tidy coincidences, and I have never once believed Simon Vane misplaced a locket he did not himself put somewhere convenient. Wren went. The music-room was cold and smelled of dust and old rosewood, and the drawer, when the small key turned in it, held not jewellery but paper, a half-finished letter in a woman's hand, dated the spring before the Duchess died, addressed to a son not yet old enough to read it, practising, in careful diagrams down the margin, the very signs Wren herself used every day. Labouring to teach herself a language she would not live long enough to speak fluently, so that her boy would never again have to sit in a room and be laughed at by someone who thought his silence meant his understanding had gone with his hearing. Tucked beneath it lay a second paper in a different hand entirely, cramped and hurried, a draft of a letter to a money-lender in town, signed S. Vane, referencing a debt secured against funds his lordship's trust would shortly be made to yield, once certain arrangements, the word certain underlined twice, were concluded by Michaelmas. Wren stood in the cold room with both papers in her 2 hands, and understood, all at once, the whole shape of the thing, the way her father used to understand, in one look, the exact fault in a clock that had defeated every other eye in the shop. The wedding settlement was to be signed in 2 days. She did not leave Alderley that night. She went instead, in the dark, to the small cottage at the edge of the home farm, where Thomas Reeve lodged, Mr. Vane's clerk. A thin, anxious young man of 22, who had copied out every false transcript in that book in his own careful hand, because a man who employed him also held his widowed mother's cottage lease. And she laid both papers on his table, and asked him only one question, the only one that mattered, whether the words he had been given to copy had ever, once, matched the words spoken in the room. Thomas Reeve looked at the Duchess's letter a long time, and then at the moneylender's draft, and something in his thin shoulders gave way like a fence-post finely rotted through. He wrote out, that same night, in his own hand and under his own name, an account of every instance he could remember where Mr. Vane had dictated a transcript before the meeting it purported to record had even taken place. Wren carried both documents at dawn to Mr. Percival Loam, the family's solicitor, a dry, precise man newly arrived to oversee the settlement's signing, and told him plainly that she was the maid dismissed 4 days past for a theft she believed had never occurred, and that she was asking him, as an officer sworn to the family's true interest and not merely its comfort, to delay the signing by 1 hour to examine what she had brought. Mr. Loam read the letters twice. He asked her 3 questions, sharp as pinpricks, and she answered all 3 without flinching, and at the end of it he folded the papers into his coat and said only that the signing would proceed as scheduled, in the great hall, before all the assembled family, and that she had better be present to say, in that room, exactly what she had just said to him. "It is not enough to be right in a drawing-room, Miss Calder," he said, gathering his hat. "Wrongs done in company must be undone in company, in the light, before the same witnesses who saw them done, or they are never truly undone at all." The great hall at Alderley had been dressed for a wedding settlement. White flowers already wilting slightly in the morning heat, and the family and its intimates stood arranged around the long table, as though for a portrait nobody present entirely wished to sit for. The Duke grey and upright in his chair by the hearth, Miss Cordelia Ashe pale, and composed beside her mother, Simon Vane at the table's head, with the settlement papers squared before him corner to corner, his cuffs as ever immaculate. Gabriel stood a little apart, his face closed, his hands still, and Wren, entering behind Mr. Loam with Mrs. Pruitt and a white-faced Thomas Reeve a step behind her, watched his eyes find her across the room and hold there, unreadable, before the solicitor's voice cut through the murmur and asked that the signing wait 1/4 of an hour for a matter touching the settlement's very foundation. Simon Vane rose smoothly. "Your Grace, this is precisely the impertinence I warned you of," he began. But Mr. Loam was already laying 2 documents on the table in the full light from the tall windows, and asking Thomas Rave, in a voice that carried to every corner of the hall, to state plainly whose hand had written the transcript dated the 14th of last month recording his lordship's consent to this match. "It was mine, sir," Thomas said, and his voice cracked on the second word, but the words in it were never his lordship's. They were given to me the evening before the meeting took place, before a single sign had passed between anyone. A silence opened in the room the way ice opens on a pond, without warning, all at once. Simon Vane said, too quickly, that a frightened boy would say anything under pressure, and Mr. Loam said only, "Then let us ask his lordship directly, in the language he actually speaks," and turned to Wren. "Miss Calder, if you would." Wren crossed the room, and stood before Gabriel, and signed, slowly enough for every eye that had ever mocked him to follow every motion of her hands. "Did you, on the 14th, tell your cousin you were eager for this match?" Gabriel's answer was a single sign, flat and final. "No, I asked for time," he signed on, his hands gathering speed and certainty as the room's silence fed him courage he had not been permitted in 11 years. "I have asked for time on this matter 3 times, and been told each time that my father's health could not bear the asking, and I believed that, because I had no way to know it was a lie, until a maid taught me that my own hands were worth more than anyone in this family had ever let them be." Mrs. Pruitt, translating aloud for the Duke in a voice that shook only slightly, repeated every word. The old Duke's cane struck the floor once, hard. Simon Vane's composure, immaculate for 11 years, cracked at last down its centre, and what came through the crack was not menace, but something closer to grief. His hands no longer smoothing his cuffs, but pressed flat to the table as though to hold himself upright by it. "I have a daughter," he said, low, to no one, to everyone. "Lucy, she is 11, and she is dying by inches of the same fever that took her mother, and the physicians in London want more than I will ever earn honestly in this house, and I told myself, every single time, that I was only borrowing against a future that would belong to him regardless, that he would never miss it, that I was protecting him besides, keeping him safe from strangers who wanted only his title." He looked up, and for one unguarded moment his face held nothing false in it at all. "I told myself so many things," he said. I do not think I believed any of them any more. Cordelia Ashe spoke into the silence that followed, quietly, her hand no longer at her pearls, but pressed flat against the table, like Simon's own. I was told his lordship wished this match, and only feared to say so plainly, for shyness. I would not have come within a mile of this hall, had I known the truth of it. I release him, gladly, and I am ashamed it took another woman's courage to show me what I ought to have asked myself. The Duke, when he spoke at last, spoke slowly, each word costing him visible effort, and said that there would be no trial, no scandal carried beyond these walls, no ruin heaped on a man who had already ruined himself thoroughly enough, that Simon Vane would leave Alderley within the week for a cottage on the family's Yorkshire land, with an allowance sufficient for his daughter's care, and not 1 shilling more, and that this was not mercy owed to the guilty, but mercy owed to a sick child who had done nothing to earn her father's crimes. Simon Vane did not argue. He bowed once to the Duke, and once, with a courtesy that had finally become entirely honest, to Gabriel, and walked out of the great hall a smaller man than he had walked into it, though not, Wren thought, watching him go, an unforgiven one. It was a full week before Gabriel came to her again, because there were papers to unmake and a father to nurse back from the shock of his own long blindness, and when he finally found her it was in the music room, where she had gone to return the small brass key to its proper hook, and had lingered, instead reading once more the Duchess's unfinished letter, with the tears she had not spent in the great hall finally arriving, late and entire. He did not startle her, he had learned, in 11 years, to announce himself by the shift of light in a doorway, and she looked up to find him watching her, the way he had watched her that first night in the corridor, as a man watches something he has decided, against long practice, to hope for. He signed, slowly, that he had spoken to his father about her father Josiah, about a workshop and a name that deserved better than the parish had given it, and that the Duke, still weak but no longer blind, had agreed there would be a school built on the home farm within the year, for children whose hands spoke a language the rest of the county had never troubled to learn, and that it would carry the Calder name over its door, because a debt owed to a dead man's teaching was a debt he intended to pay in full. Wren could not, for a moment, make her hands answer at all. Then Gabriel signed the rest, the part he had clearly been saving, his hands steady though something in his face was not. You told me once that hands do not lie, only mouths. I have thought of nothing else for a week. I am not asking you to marry me because you saved me in that hall, though you did, and I will spend my life grateful for it. I am asking because you are the first person who ever asked me what I wished for, instead of deciding it on my behalf, and I find I cannot stop wishing you would ask me something else besides. Marry me because you wish it, he signed, and nothing else. It is the only reason I will accept. Wren's answer, when it came, was not a sign at all but a single word, spoken aloud in the small cold room, because some doors, once opened, want the whole voice, and not merely the hands, yes. He read it on her mouth before her hands had even finished rising, and the smile that broke over his face was not the startled half-laugh of the estate office, but something larger and entirely unguarded, and outside the tall window a lark that had nested in the eaves since before the old Duchess died began, as it always did at that hour, to sing. They were married quietly in October, in the small chapel rather than the great hall, with no settlement papers spread anywhere in sight, Mrs. Pruitt weeping without a shred of shame into a handkerchief she had clearly brought for the purpose, Thomas Reeve standing straighter than he had stood in months, kept on at the estate by Gabriel's own insistence and doing honest work at last. Cordelia Ashe sent a length of fine lace as a gift and a letter announcing her own engagement to a widowed baronet who had loved her sincerely for 2 years and had never once needed a lie to win her attention. Simon Vane wrote once from Yorkshire a short letter thanking Gabriel for a mercy he had not earned, and reporting that Lucy's cough had eased with the sea air. Gabriel read it twice and put it away without comment, which Wren understood by now as its own kind of forgiveness. The old Duke lived to see the following spring, and spent much of it in the music-room, learning, with his son's patient hand over his own, the clumsy first signs of a language he should have learned 11 years sooner, saying more than once that he had spent so long guarding his boy from the world that he had never once thought to ask the boy what guarding he actually wanted. The school opened above the chapel that same spring, Josiah Calder's name carved plain and permanent over its door, and on the day it opened, Wren stood in the doorway of the great hall, exactly where she had stood the day the laughter started, and watched Gabriel cross the same floor toward a knot of guests, who this time turned to greet him with hands already lifted, clumsy and earnest, forming the small signs he had taught half the county himself over the winter. And nobody in that room laughed at his silence any more, because his silence, at last, had a voice everyone had troubled themselves to learn. If this story warmed you, if some part of you has ever sat in a room full of people deciding, without asking, what you were and were not capable of understanding, come sit by the fire a while longer with me. There is a chair kept warm here, and a kettle that never quite goes cold, and I would love nothing more than to hear, in the comments, which line stayed with you longest, the letter in the locked drawer, or the lark at the window, or the single word spoken aloud after a whole story told in silence. Stay a while, keep your place by the hearth, and I will keep the next story warm until you're back for it. Sleep well tonight, and be gentle with the quiet ones you never do know, until you trouble to ask how much they have been wanting to answer.